don't know. Does anyone know what you do in PowerPoint? The bottom? Which one? This? Okay, perfect. Oh, but now something.
Okay, it will go on.
It will, all right.
Oh, yes.
Oh, perfect.
Okay, thank you. Well, let me start with a comment concerning this word astounding, which of course is very subjective. Well, if this were a conference or a workshop on medieval logic, it would not be astonishing or surprising for any of the participants, but here perhaps I hope that it will be surprising for some of you at least, and I want to tell you how I became interested in medieval logic at all. So as a student of mathematics and philosophy in the late 1960s, I learned ordinary logic, which also comprised a brief introduction into the theory of the syllogism, of course. And then in 1983, I hit upon Leibniz's Fragmente zur Logik, and I was surprised to see that this 17th century philosopher had discovered a way to transform the theory of the syllogism into what I call an algebra of concepts. And this algebra of concepts could be proven to be equivalent to Boole's extensional algebra of sets. And then 10 years later, I happened to study Occam's Summa Logicae, and I was again surprised that this author from the early 14th century had already knowledge of basically all principles of modal propositional logic. So then, the next step in 2018, I came into contact with proponents of so-called connexive logic, and a closer examination of this issue opened my eyes for the actuality of the sophisticated ideas of medieval logicians. Meanwhile, I fully endorse the following judgment. Medieval logicians have a great deal to teach their modern descendants. They discussed issues that are of contemporary importance with an ingenuity and sophistication lost till this century. Let me only mention 3 other famous logicians from that area here who share such a high esteem of medieval logic. It's a late G.E. Hughes, then Christopher Martin from the University of Auckland, and also Paul Thom from the University of Sydney. Well, I will talk mainly about the contribution of medieval logicians to issues of connexive logic. They first of all mention Abelard, then Alberic of Paris, and some logic schools of the 13th century. This is something which has already been analyzed before by Christopher Martin. And then I will turn to some authors from the 14th and 15th century, Kilbartby, Burley, Buridan, and Paul of Venice. And then finally, I will touch upon contributions of these logicians to issues of relevance logic and paraconsistent logic, especially with respect to the famous principles ex impossibile quod libet and ex contradictorio quod libet. And here I'll deal with Buridan and Paul of Venice, and then also skip somewhat outside the temporal limits of the medieval period and deal shortly with Karamuel Lobkowitz. So what is connexive logic? The notion itself was coined in 1963 by Storrs McCall, and according to the official definition in the Standard Encyclopedia, a logic is connexive if and only if its implication operator is connexive. And this in turn means that the implication operator satisfies certain laws, such as Aristotle's thesis. And here actually we have 2 theses. The first one says that no proposition Q is implied both by a proposition P and by P's negation. And Aristotle's second thesis says that no proposition Q is implied by its own negation. And now, this is my point, so to speak, in this modern discussion. I think one really has to distinguish two forms of connectivism, so-called humble connectivity versus hardcore connectivity. The terms themselves were introduced only recently, but the distinction was basically known already in the Middle Ages. In 2012, McCall argued that connective logic was founded by Aristotle, Chrysippus, and Boëthius, that it was further developed by medieval logicians like Abelard, Kilbarby, and Paul of Venice, and then it was rediscovered in the 19th and 20th century by Lewis Carroll, Hugh McCall, and especially also Albert J. Lenzen. Then from 1960 and onwards, connective logic was finally transformed into a non-classical calculi, which partly concur with systems of relevance logic and paraconsistent logic. But recently, I showed that this historical analysis is fundamentally mistaken, since it doesn't take into account these two mentioned versions of connectivism. Humble connectivism maintains that the connective properties only apply to normal antecedents, while hardcore connectivism insists that they also hold for abnormal propositions. But the overwhelming majority of all medieval logicians defended only humble connectivism. So once again, hardcore insists that these principles hold for absolutely every proposition, and these are the corresponding formulas, only small variants. We don't have to look into any details. And the humble aspect is that they admit some exceptions, namely the exceptions are either impossible antecedents or necessary consequence in this way, for instance. Okay. Another point which I think is very important in these discussions are the distinction between two kinds of paradoxical propositions. First of all, one can consider propositions which only refute themselves, in the sense that the assumption P would be true entails that P is false. And one famous example discussed not only the medieval period, but even earlier, is this one: Socrates knows that he is dead. According to Lukáševič, this paradox was discussed already by the ancient philosopher Origenes, and the following consideration, of course, is behind this paradox. If you know that you are dead, or one cannot know something false, truth condition. If you know that you are dead, you are not dead, for a dead person knows nothing. Hence, you don't know that you are dead. The second type of paradoxical proposition are real antinomies, where the assumption that P is true entails that P is false, and conversely, the assumption that P is false entails that P is true. And this, of course, is incompatible with the fundamental axiom of classical logic, according to which each proposition is either true or false. And the best known example of such antinomies are the liar paradox and Russell's antinomy, resulting from a consideration of the set of all sets, which are not elements of themselves. Now, let's enter into medieval logic. This is the important book by Peter Abelard, Dialectica. Abelard was convinced of the validity of Aristotle's thesis, according to which, as he expressed it in his Latin language, ad affirmationem et negationem ejustem non sequitur idem consequens. And he discusses thesis in connection with the example, the propositions: if he, for instance, Socrates is a man, he is an animal, and if he is not a man, he is an animal. These propositions cannot both be true, because otherwise one might derive the inconveniency: if he is not an animal, he is an animal. However, Abelard was confronted with counterexamples. The first example has been reconstructed by Chris Martin from medieval text, Introductiones Montanae Minores. And the argument is as follows, quite elementary. If Socrates is a man and a stone, Socrates is a man. If he is a man, he is not a stone. So if he is a man and a stone, Socrates is not a stone. But if Socrates is not a stone, Socrates is not a stone, a man and a stone. So finally, if Socrates is a man and a stone, Socrates is not a man and a stone. And the second step here in this argument rests on a principle called locus ab oppositis. And this is the following idea. In the tradition of Boetius, logicians normally adopt this topic as a rule. Si aliquod oppositorum predicator de aliquo, eius oppositum removetur ab eodem, which means roughly that if one of two opposite predicates or concepts is predicated of a certain subject, then the other predicate has to be denied from the same subject. And the talking of opposite here means either it's a contradictory opposite, just a negation of a concept or predicate A, or it may also be the contrary opposite, which means that this no entity X can have both properties A and B, but there may well exist some entities, objects Y, which have neither of these properties. In any case, whenever A and B are opposite concepts, then one can infer if X has a property A, it will not have the property B. And in particular, we would say if X is a man, it follows that X is not a stone. Now, Abelard rejected this conditional, if Socrates is a man, Socrates is not a stone, because in his opinion, this implication is not relevantly valid. Any negative property like that of not being a stone, it cannot be contained in the positive property of being a man. Of course, Abelard's main motivation for the rejection of this particular example was the wish to refute the inconveniency of the violation of the connective principles. However, a certain Alberic of Paris showed that even without the assumption of this locus ab oppositis, one can construct counterexamples to the connective thesis. And this is, again, from the work of Chris Martin. The argument starts with first premise. If Socrates is a man and is not an animal, then of course Socrates is not an animal. Next step, if he's not an animal, Socrates is not a man. Third step, if he is not a man, it's not the case that Socrates is a man and not an animal. And final conclusion, if Socrates is a man and not an animal, it's not the case that Socrates is a man and not an animal. And since this conclusion has this logical structure, it constitutes a counterexample to one of these connective theses. It's Abelard's second thesis. Now, let's have a short look at the logical principles behind these arguments. In the first step, what we have here is just an instance of the simple scheme of conjunctive simplification. In step two, what is done here is contraposition is applied to a formula of the structure P implies Q, which is of course not logically valid, but which is maybe called it's analytically valid. It's an analytic truth that whoever is a man is an animal. And then by contraposition, you get this. And so in the next step, again, we only need conjunctive simplification and contraposition. And in the last step, transitivity. So very elementary logical principles behind this argument. So reactions. As Martin reported, we do not know how Abelard responded to this argument, but it clearly illustrates the difficulties of constructing a connective logic. Then 2 years ago, I published this book. And there I also showed, among many other things, that Abelard, of course, fully endorsed the principles which I've elaborated in connection with Albrecht's argument, namely conjunctive simplification, contraposition, transitivity. Therefore, it's no surprise that confronted with this argument, Master Peter essentially threw up his hands and granted its necessity. But other logicians in that period made attempts to escape Albrecht's traps. Let's first have a look at the way out of the so-called Montani. Their idea is that the conjunction, if it has an affirmative part and a negative part, then it entails only the affirmative part, but not the latter. This sounds somewhat ad hoc, but they try to argue why that should be the case. They argued a negation is not so powerful when joined with an affirmation as it is when it is alone. And something follows from a negation alone, which does not follow from it when it is conjoined with an affirmation. And they try to further argue for this abstract principles by means of the following example. This example, let's have a look at this, is let's say conclusive, or it's at least, it sounds good. The example says, from the negation, Socrates doesn't dispute when conjoined with the affirmation when Plato is reading, it doesn't follow Socrates doesn't discuss with anybody, although this letter follows when the proposition Socrates doesn't dispute is put forward per se. But this example of a conjointness of two propositions, of course, is not a real conjunction, as it would have to be formed by and or something similar, but it's rather a conditionalization formed by when. And hence this example cannot be used to support this abstract argument, and hence to refute Albrecht's counterexample. The second way out was chosen by the school of the Meludinenses, which are the followers of Robert of Melun. They defended the view that no consequent at all follows from an impossible antecedent. They believed that the omission of conditionals with impossible antecedents would lead to outright inconsistencies. Here's a corresponding passage from their main work, Ars Meliduna. If one assumes the opposite, it can be proven that the proposition entails its own negation, and that two contradictories follow from one and the same proposition. Each of these conclusions seems to be against the art, for just as nothing can both be true and not be true, so it cannot be the case that two contradictories follow from one and the same proposition. But here one has to object, of course, no proposition Q can be both true and false, according to standards of classical propositional logic. And therefore, Q and non-Q cannot both be implied by one and the same true proposition. This is trivial, but it does not mean that Q and non-Q cannot both be implied by any proposition at all. It is not against the art that the self-contradictory conjunction Q and non-Q implies both Q and non-Q. So a third way out then was attempted by this school of the Poretani, the followers of Gilbert of Poitiers. And what they have is they reject the laws of conjunctive simplification. In their opinion, whoever holds that if P implies Q, then also P and R, for arbitrary R, implies Q, whoever does this commit the fallacy non causa ut causa. The conjunctive antecedent P and R is preposed as the cause of the consequent Q, but the true cause of Q is P alone, while P and R is a not cause, and non-causa. Well, as Chris Martin remarked already, this idea, this reservation, concern exactly the point made by Everett Nelson in his account for the intentional relationship holding between the antecedent and the consequent of a true conditional. Let's now have a look at Kilbartby's philosophy or logic developed in this book, Notulae Libri Priorum, very thick volume, edited a few years ago by Paul Thom and collaborator. And Kilbartby defended the connexive principles raised by other, against objections raised by other logicians. But he soon recognized that the laws of disjunction also give rise to counterexamples, especially the simple one. If you are sitting, then either you are sitting or you are not sitting. And similarly, if you are not sitting, then the same thing follows. More generally, these theorems, simple laws of for the operator of disjunction, they are simply incompatible with Aristotle's thesis, with the connexive thesis. Kilbartby nevertheless tried to defend Aristotle's thesis by arguing that in this example, as he expressed it, or that generally something can follow in two ways, namely either by virtue of the same thing in it or by virtue of different things in it, whatever that means. And then he says, so Aristotle understands that something does not follow of necessity from the same things being so and not being so, and by virtue of the same thing. However, this condition appears to have been introduced entirely ad hoc, and even McCall came to admit that it is doubtful that Aristotle intended any such thing. And it appears we must accept the fact that the type of implication for which Aristotle's thesis holds cannot consistently admit of conditionals of the form if P, then either P or Q. And so also Kilbartby in the end granted that from the impossible, its opposite follows, and the necessary follow from its opposite. And this was also clearly recognized by Walter Burley, one of my favorite logicians from that period, who first of all noted this principle. It's plain that the contradictory of a disjunction composed of contradictories implies both contradictories. This is the abstract law transformed into a formula modern style. And in this connection, Burley remarked, suppose someone says contradictories do not follow from the same antecedent, for in that case, the same thing would follow from contradictories, which seems to be contrary to the philosopher in prior analytics, who says the same consequent does not follow from the same antecedent affirmed and denied. I say that the same consequent does not follow from the same antecedent affirmed and denied unless the opposite of that consequent includes contradictories, that is, unless the consequent is necessary. And this is the humble way in which Aristotle's statement or thesis has to be understood. This was also recognized by Buridan. Here I show you only one important work from Buridan, which was edited, translated, and commented by G. Hughes in the 1980s. And one of these remarks which Buridan made is this one, which looks quite harmless. He says, a possible proposition never entails its own contradictory. But as Hughes rightly emphasized, note that the principle appealed to is not that no proposition whatsoever can entail its own contradictory, but only that no possible proposition can do so. This is a standard principle of modal logic, an alternative formulation is any proposition that entails its own contradictory is impossible. So Buridan in effect argues that the hardcore principle that P never entails non-P should be modified in this humble way. If P is possible, then it cannot happen that P implies or entails its own negation. Now, finally, how many minutes? Okay, I'll try to make it within the next 3 or 4 minutes. So this well-known principle, of course, says if P is impossible, then this antecedent implies any proposition Q. This is ex impossibile quodlibet. And what I want to point out is that this principle follows from 2 things. Namely, on the one hand, from a general law of modal logic, and from the conception or definition of conditionals as strict implications. In the sense of this definition, P strictly implies Q, means it is not possible that P is true while Q is false. And the modal principle, which you also need, is this elementary one. If a conjunction of 2 propositions is possible, then each conjunct has to be possible as well. And already Abelard noticed that this gives the following result. For Abelard it was clear, quod enim omnino non esse pot est, et sine ille non pot est esse. Therefore, for instance, the proposition Socrates is a stone, which is impossible, entails another impossibility, Socrates is an ass. Ass is a standard medieval example. It's not meant as an insult. It's just asinus, a different animal. Because it's impossible that Socrates should be a stone, and so impossible that he should be a stone without being an ass. This is the analysis already given by the Niels. And conclusion here, whoever accepts the conception of strict implication has to endorse the principles ex impossibile quodlibet. Now, this principle should be distinguished from a related one, ex contradictorio quodlibet, which says if the antecedent is self-contradictory, then it entails or implies any other proposition Q. And one instance of this would be this formula that the self-contradictory conjunction of P and non-P entails Q for each Q. And a proof of this principle, which was then later rediscovered by C.I. Lewis, this proof was already known in the 12th century. According to a report in Joan of Salisbury Metallogicon, the proof was most likely invented by a certain William of Soissons. At any rate, it was elaborated in the Ars Miliduna, and it also presented as an indubitable principle in Alexander Neckham's De Naturis Rerum of 1180. So this is Buridan's formulation. Now it will follow, just another look at his books. On the one hand, this important collection of sophisms on meaning and truth, and then the treatise on consequences. And here's Buridan's proof. For example, this follows every B is A and some B is not A, so a stick stands in the corner. This again, a stick stands in a corner. This may be two. This is just a paradigm example of a contingent proposition, which has nothing to do with or if not B, every B is A. So here's his argument for from every B is A and some B is not A, it follows that every B is A, since from a conjunction each of its conjuncts follows. Then from every B is A, it follows that either every B is A or a stick stands in the corner, since anything implies itself in disjunction with anything else. Then from this, in the second part of the original antecedent, let me argue like this. Every B is A or a stick stands in the corner, and some B is not A, so a stick stands in the corner. This is a case of a disjunctive syllogism that from a disjunction, if either disjunct is denied, the other may be inferred. So finally, from the first to the last, from the original antecedent, the stated conclusion follows, because by transitivity, whatever follows from the consequent follows from the antecedent. And then, again, I think this is quite interesting and important. Buridan tried to do more than had already been done by the other logicians of that time. He tried to prove the stronger principle, ex impossibile quod libet, and he made use of a principle which sounds quite plausible, the principle of the redundancy of necessities, saying if a certain conclusion Q can be derived from, or if it logically follows from two premises P1 and P2, and if one of these premises is necessary, then Q follows from the other premise alone. Quite plausible. And then he can argue, so let's suppose that proposition P1 itself is impossible. Then, of course, the negation is necessary. But according to the principle ex contradictorio quod libet, which we have proven already, from these two premises, P1 and non-P1, any Q follows. But now we drop this necessary second premise, non-P1, and obtain that Q follows from P1 alone. Great argument, but, well, Buridan thought that this principle would be logically valid, but his proof turned out to be circular. Anyway, in contrast to the ex contradictorio quod libet principle, the ex impossibile principle is not a theorem of modal logic in the normal sense. Finally, I want to make a few remarks concerning the logical insights of Paul of Venice, who, among others, published or wrote this book. He didn't publish it. Logica Parva. There he discussed an objection that had been raised against the principle ex impossibile quod libet. Namely, as a corollary of this principle, it follows that each impossible proposition entails its own negation. And then the objection that contemporaries of Paul of Venice had raised against this idea is the following one, this quotation: it does not follow some man is a donkey, ass or donkey, same. Therefore, no man is a donkey, because the contradictory of the consequent stands with the antecedent insofar as it is interchanged with that very proposition. Well, this objection rests on the usual conception, according to which an inference is valid if and only if it's impossible that the antecedent or premise be true and the consequent or conclusion nevertheless false, which means such an inference is invalid if it's possible that P is true while Q is false, which again means P is true and the opposite of Q is also true. Now, medieval logicians expressed the joint possibility or compossibility of propositions also by saying that they stand together. And so the argument, which I've given before, amounts to the following thing. With respect to inferences of the form P implies non-P, it is argued that the antecedent P always stands with or stands together with the consequent non-P, because the negation or the opposite of this consequent, which is doubly negated P, is equivalent with the antecedent or with the premise. This is a logical core of idea of this argument. But here now let's have a look how Paul of Venice replied to this. He said, it's not absurd from one of two opposites to infer the other one, given that the proposition in question is impossible. I deny that the opposite of the consequence stands with the antecedent, and I deny the inference the opposite of the consequence is interchange or equivalent with the antecedent, therefore it stands with that proposition. For Paul, the negation of no man is a donkey does not stand with the antecedent some man is a donkey. Both propositions are equivalent, but since both are impossible, they are not compatible with themselves. And Paul concludes that any proposition in the world would follows from an impossible proposition, and any proposition is repugnant to an impossible proposition. Indeed, it is repugnant to its very self because it implies the opposite of its very self. Hence, once again, we have only this humble principle. And this is basically my last slide. The pathos with which Paul emphasizes that every proposition in the world follows from an impossibility, like a man is a donkey, remarkably resembles the pathos with which, almost 300 years later, Juan Caramuel y Lobkowitz asked, but what bad things would occur in the world if per impossibile two contradictory propositions would be true together? Or what if per impossibile one and the same proposition would be both true and false? I answer, then in the whole world not a single truth would remain. And this somewhat paradoxical conclusion has to be understood as follows. If two contradictory propositions would both be true, then by means of the principle ex contradictoria quod libet, any Q could be shown to be true. For instance, also an absurdity like 2 is not equal to 2. And thus, at least metaphorically speaking, the truth of an indubitable proposition like 2 equals 2 would be destroyed. In this sense, not a single truth would remain. So, as we have 2 more slides concerning paraconsistent logic, Graham Priest wrote in this small article that contemporary logical orthodoxy has it that from contradictory premises anything follows. A logical consequence relation is explosive if, according to it, any arbitrary conclusion is entailed by any arbitrary contradiction A and non-A. Paraconsistent logic challenges this orthodoxy. A logical consequence relation is said to be paraconsistent if it's not explosive. Thus, if a consequence relation is paraconsistent, then the consequence relation does not explode into triviality. Now, the use of the word explosive indicates that priests and others are somewhat afraid of a situation where the whole world, or at least the whole world of propositions, collapses because everything becomes provable. But this fear, it's my opinion, is unjustified. As Caramuel argued, such bad things after an explosion would happen if per impossibile 2 contradictory propositions would both be true. But don't worry, it's impossible that both A and non-A are true. Therefore, nobody has to be afraid that the set of all true propositions explodes into the universal set.